Let's discuss the core issue, I guess, of wages. Prior to doing the show, I feel like I do this at least once a year, where I sort of sit down and I do a deep dive on, have wages really stagnated and to what extent and why? Because there's so much like opposition to this idea. Like, for instance, if you type in wage stagnation plus Reddit, a ton of results are from the Ask Economist subreddit, which is it's a pretty right-wing subreddit. You have like usernames that I was reading today, like Barry Goldwater Lover, among others. And so they're kind of like in denial about this. And I think there is something to the idea that for perhaps, maybe it's a majority, maybe it's a plurality, but let's just say for the sake of argument, a large percentage of Americans have improved their standard of living compared to like maybe 50 years ago. What people should really focus on is the following. So first of all, if you just break it according to the lines of productivity versus wages, it's obvious that productivity is way, way, way higher, and wages have not kept up with productivity. It's not even so much that I'm against this notion of competition. I'm more so interested in competition for what? What exactly are we competing over? Because, it's great to say that America's GDP is increasing, but if that does not really, truly, substantially increase your standard of living, it's worthless, right? That GDP is totally worthless for the average person.
Yeah, real wages have been falling since Q1 2021. As we have been coming out of COVID and inflation has spiked, wages have dropped, adjusted for inflation over the last couple of years. There was a brief spike up during COVID, but it's spiking back down now. And I think a lot of people thought that COVID was going to permanently transform the situation, but a pandemic without any organization, any real strong labor organization, is not going to produce any kind of permanent transformation of the relations of power, especially when it doesn't disrupt capital mobility or international trade very far. I think one of the things also to bear in mind is that when we talk about the inflation adjustment, not only are we talking about, say, the median, or sometimes even the average, which can be heavily influenced by what's going on for people at the top, but also when we talk about inflation, there are some stuff in the basket of inflation that have seen price increases that are lower than the statutory inflation rate, and other stuff where the prices increased much higher than the statutory inflation rate. And generally, the stuff that has increased at a lower rate is stuff that is not as important as the stuff that has increased at a higher rate. And the three things that I would draw attention to that have increased at a much higher rate than the statutory rate are healthcare, college education, and housing. Those are the things that have gone absolutely crazy through the roof. And they're some of the basic fundamental things that people need to live decent lives. The things that have gone up at lower rates are things like televisions, personal computers, appliances, cars. These are things that, while certainly important and beneficial, are not as important as those basic fundamental things. And generally, the market doesn't distinguish between, is this something that people need or is this something that people don't need? It's just a question of what are people buying. And because people will always buy healthcare and education and housing, almost no matter what the market conditions are, it's very, very difficult to blunt demand for those things because people need these things to get by. They might be able to settle for renting instead of buying a house, or going to community college instead of going to a four-year college, or going to their local doctor rather than traveling into a major city to go to a big famous hospital. They'll make certain adjustments in the standard that they accept. But people will not just not go to college generally, and people will not forego healthcare generally, and people will not just live in the street. Some number of people will do all of these things and be badly disadvantaged for it, but most people will not. And that gives the firms that provide those services incredible leverage over ordinary people and incredible leverage over the economy. It is not at all in the interest of the healthcare sector for healthcare to become affordable, or in the higher ed sector for the university to become affordable, or in the housing sector for housing to become affordable. If there were any drop in the cost of these things, it would result in major job losses and contraction of these sectors. The biggest argument against Medicare for All is that if your goal is to reduce, say, healthcare as a percentage of GDP from 17 or 18%, where it is now in the United States, to a number that is similar to the number that you would see in another Western country, which is around 10%, you would destroy an enormous number of jobs in the course of doing that, unless you also had a policy to transition all of those people to some other kind of work. And the most negative disruption that would be caused by a move to Medicare for all is just figuring out what to do with all these unnecessary workers that we have in insurance, in hospital administration, and even in some cases in things like nursing, where there's just been an enormous explosion in the definition of what counts as nursing, and an enormous pouring of people into these jobs and into these roles. So if we actually wanted to get control of these things, we would have to really disrupt these sectors in quite fundamental ways to get control. And that's why every time we start talking about fixing these things, everybody goes, oh, if you try to reform it, we're all going to leave the profession. If you try to reform it, we're all going to, what will we do? Because we would actually have to contract these sectors substantially. They've become so overgrown through the market leverage that the firms that provide these services have achieved, that it's a big lift. And it requires concentrated political power. It's not enough for it to just be what's best for the ordinary person. You really need organization to break the influence of these sectors, the firms and oligarchs that dominate these sectors, the very, very strong positions that they're in.
If, for example, you would put some of these comments to some of these Redditors, like an objection would be like, well, housing costs have gone up. This is true. But at the same time, first of all, most people only buy a house only once. But then again, it's the only kind of multi-$100,000 purchase they would ever make in their life. They're not, and it's very large, right? So, but the space per person has really gone up substantially, something like 2 times or whatever, compared to like something in the 50s or 60s. So you're essentially paying, just like as we do like inflation adjusted here, I guess the inflation would be inflation in size, more people taking on more and more space. Housing is actually, with the exception of like the big cities, housing is more or less keeping with inflation, but not it's not like substantially going higher than that. And they would say something like, well, healthcare is expensive and wages might be down in some regards. But if you look at total compensation, things like healthcare, obviously people are, experiencing more and more kind of like benefits, I guess, in some ways when it comes to healthcare. But, my response would be like, well, look, it's simply because healthcare is just kind of going up substantially, right? These are not
they
benefits.
love to try to make the argument that total compensation has gone up because your health insurance has become way more expensive for your employer to buy for you.
Exactly.
It's a terrible argument that in no way improves the circumstance of the ordinary person. They also like to cough up this stuff about, the square footage of the houses is getting bigger. That just implies that only very rich people are buying homes. So because wealthy people are buying homes, those homes are bigger. And then everybody else is renting and trapped and not able to get out from renting. Yeah. And that, this is something, because it's a purchase that you only make once generally, and you only make once when you're, in your 20s or 30s, it's something which sets your wealth and your position in society to a very substantial degree. So if you need to buy a house at a time when you would be badly disadvantaged versus other people in previous generations who've bought houses, and you don't buy a house and you continue renting, or you buy the wrong house, these are things that will permanently change not just your situation, but the situation of your whole family in terms of the location of the house, the quality of the school district the house is in. All of these things completely change somebody's life chances, their children's life chances. So it blights an entire generation when people are dealing with, for many, many years at a time, incredibly high house prices. You get entire societies where you have, for instance, in the United Kingdom, a whole generation of people who own the vast bulk of the housing stock is owned by retirees now in the UK. Retirees and, of course, very wealthy landowners. And so it's almost impossible for someone to get on if they're younger. And we're moving in that direction here. We haven't gone as far as the UK has, or as, say, Canada has. Canada is another country with a terrible housing stock problem. But we're moving in that direction. And the economists are just complacent about this. They don't care. And they don't care because economists are generally well compensated as people, and they're doing fine themselves personally.